The year was 1892. Inside a private conference room at the offices of Drexel, Morgan & Company in Lower Manhattan, the air smelled of cigar smoke and old money. Winter light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. At the head of that table sat J.P. Morgan. His expression was cold, calculating, the kind of face that had financed railroads and broken strikes. On the mahogany surface in front of him lay a stack of legal documents 2 inches thick. Patent disputes, lawsuits, injunctions. The paperwork of an industry at war with itself. The American electrical industry was tearing itself apart. Edison's company controlled direct current, the technology that powered his famous Pearl Street station. Thomson-Houston dominated alternating current, the superior system that could travel farther with less loss. And Westinghouse was bleeding them both in the courts, fighting over who owned the future. Morgan didn't call this meeting to debate the merits of AC versus DC. He didn't care which technology won. He called this meeting to end the war, because wars were expensive, and Morgan hated waste. The merger was decided in a matter of hours. Edison General Electric Company, Thomson-Houston Electric Company. Combined capitalization, $50 million. More money than most men could imagine. And from that room on April 15th, 1892, something new was born. Not through invention, not through genius, through consolidation. The General Electric Company. They called it progress. They called it the future. The newspapers ran stories about how American innovation would light the world. But what they built wasn't just a company. It was a machine designed to control the infrastructure of the modern world and to ensure that nothing it touched would last longer than necessary. This is the story of that machine and the darkness it left behind. Thomas Edison's name was on the door. It was on the letterhead. It was in the newspapers. But within months, it wasn't on the company. The new entity was called General Electric, not Edison Electric. That wasn't an accident. It was a message. Edison was a prolific inventor. He held over 1,000 patents. He'd built the first commercial power station in America. But he was a terrible businessman. He spent money on experiments that went nowhere. He refused to accept that alternating current was superior to his beloved direct current. He was stubborn, visionary, and completely unfit to run a company that Morgan needed to generate returns. The man Morgan installed to run GE was Charles Coffin, the former head of Thomson-Houston. Coffin was everything Edison wasn't. He was organized, ruthless, and focused entirely on the bottom line. He didn't care about light bulbs as art. He didn't care about the elegance of a filament or the beauty of a glowing element. He cared about light bulbs as revenue, as units sold, as market share captured. Coffin's strategy was simple. Control every part of the supply chain. Don't just make light bulbs. Make the generators that produce the power. Make the motors that consume it. Make the transformers that step it up and down. Make the transmission lines that carry it across cities. By 1900, GE didn't just sell electricity. It sold the entire system. From the coal-fired plant on the edge of town to the socket on your bedroom wall, GE owned the path. Inside the factories that sprung up across the Northeast, the noise was deafening. Heavy iron castings clanging against steel molds. The hiss of steam escaping from turbines. The smell of hot copper wire insulation melting onto coils. The air thick with coal smoke and metal dust. GE's engineers were building infrastructure that would last 50 years. The turbines they installed in hydroelectric dams were over-engineered, built with tolerances that would survive decades of continuous operation. They were designed by men who took pride in their work. Men who believed that a machine should outlive its maker. And that was about to become a problem. Because Coffin and the men who came after him learned something critical. Durability was the enemy of growth. A light bulb that lasted forever was a light bulb you only sold once. The meeting took place in a nondescript office building in Geneva, Switzerland. December 1924. The room was small, wood-paneled, heated by a cast iron radiator that hissed and clanked in the corner. No press, no public announcement, no record in any American newspaper. Present were representatives from General Electric's International Division, led by a man named William Meinhardt. Across the table sat executives from Philips of the Netherlands, Osram of Germany, and Tungsram of Hungary. Also present were delegates from the French and British bulb manufacturers. Together, these companies controlled roughly 90% of the global light bulb market. They weren't there to innovate. They weren't there to discuss new filament materials or improved vacuum techniques. They were there to sabotage their own products. The problem they faced was simple. Light bulbs were getting too good. Before 1924, a typical household light bulb lasted between 1,500 and 2,500 hours in laboratory conditions. In laboratory conditions, engineers had built experimental bulbs that ran continuously for over 10,000 hours. There was even one bulb installed in a firehouse in Livermore, California, that had been burning since 1901 and showed no signs of stopping. But longer-lasting bulbs meant fewer sales, and fewer sales meant lower profits. The mathematics were unavoidable, and so in that room in Geneva, the Phoebus cartel was formed. The name came from Phoebus Apollo, the Greek god of light. It was meant to sound noble, scientific, progressive. What it really was a conspiracy. The cartel's founding document spelled out the plan in precise language. From that point forward, no bulb manufactured by any member would be allowed to last more than 1,000 hours. The target was set at exactly 1,000 hours, plus or minus a small margin for manufacturing variation. To enforce this rule, they set up central testing laboratories in Switzerland. Every few weeks, each manufacturer would be required to send sample bulbs for testing. Engineers in white coats would screw them into sockets and run them until they died, carefully recording the hours. If your bulbs lasted significantly longer than 1,000 hours, if they lasted 1,400 or 1,600 hours, you were fined heavily. The fines were calculated to erase any competitive advantage you might gain from selling a superior product. The cartel called this standardization. They claimed they were creating consistency across the industry, ensuring that customers knew what to expect. What it really was the first time in industrial history that a group of companies conspired not to improve a product, but to make it intentionally worse. The public was told the new bulbs were brighter and more efficient. That was technically true. The new bulbs did produce slightly more light per watt. But what they weren't told was that the bulbs had been engineered to burn out 60% faster than the previous generation. The results were immediate. Between 1926 and 1930, global bulb sales jumped from 335 million units to 420 million units. Families replaced bulbs more often. Businesses restocked their inventory twice as fast, and GE's revenue from lighting alone increased by 25%. A father in Dayton, Ohio, would come home from his shift at the factory. He'd notice the kitchen light was out. He'd drag a chair over, stand on it, and unscrew the dead bulb. The glass was still warm. He'd look at it for a moment, this thing that had lit his kitchen for the past few months, and then toss it in the trash. Saturday, he'd drive to the hardware store. He'd buy another bulb, maybe two, just to have a spare. He'd pay his money, take the bulb home, screw it in, and forget about it. He had no idea the bulb in his hand had been designed to fail, that engineers in a laboratory had carefully calculated exactly how thin to make the filament, exactly how much tungsten to use to ensure it would burn out in 1,000 hours and not a minute more. The cartel lasted until World War II, when international cooperation became impossible and key patents began to expire. But by then, the damage was done. The concept of planned obsolescence had been proven. It worked. It was profitable. And GE had learned the most important lesson in modern capitalism. The customer didn't need to know. In 1946, GE took over management of the Hanford site in Washington State. It was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The site sprawled across 580 square miles of desert along the Columbia River. From the air, it looked like an industrial city. Cooling towers, reactor buildings, chemical processing facilities connected by miles of roads and railways. But there were no civilians here, only workers with security badges and armed guards at every gate. Hanford had been built in secret during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project. Its reactors produced the plutonium for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. After the war, instead of shutting down, production expanded. The Cold War demanded more weapons, more warheads, more plutonium, and plutonium production created waste. Enormous amounts of radioactive waste. Under GE's management, the scale of contamination was staggering. Over 400 billion gallons of contaminated liquids were dumped directly into the ground. Waste tanks leaked. Radioactive materials seeped into the groundwater and flowed toward the Columbia River, the same river that farmers downstream used to irrigate their crops. But the worst thing GE did at Hanford wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. On the night of December 7, 1949, technicians in the chemical separation facility received orders to proceed with an experiment called the Green Run. The purpose was to test new monitoring equipment that American intelligence agencies would use to detect Soviet plutonium production. To create realistic conditions, they needed to release a plume of radioactive iodine into the atmosphere. A large plume. At 11:00 p.m., they opened the valves. Approximately 8,000 curies of iodine-131 were vented from the stacks. For context, the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, which caused a national panic, released an estimated 15 to 24 curies of iodine-131. This was more than 300 times that amount. There was no alarm, no warning to the towns downwind. The experiment was classified at the highest level. The people who lived in Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, the Tri-Cities just south of the reactor complex, had no idea what was happening. The wind carried the plume east, across farms and small towns. Families slept in their beds. Children played in their yards the next morning. Cows grazed in pastures, and the radioactive iodine settled into the soil, into the grass, into the milk. Iodine-131 concentrates in the thyroid gland. It causes cancer, especially in children. Within 2 decades, cancer rates in those communities began to spike. Thyroid disease became common. So did leukemia, birth defects, autoimmune disorders. Families started asking questions. Doctors started noticing patterns. And in the 1980s, when documents about the Green Run were finally declassified, the lawsuits began. GE's legal strategy was simple: blame national security. The releases were ordered by the Atomic Energy Commission. They were necessary for the defense of the nation. GE was just the contractor, following orders. The courts mostly agreed. Most claims were dismissed. A few families received small settlements with no admission of wrongdoing. The pattern repeated in Florida. In 1956, GE opened the Pinellas plant near St. Petersburg to manufacture neutron generators, precision components used to trigger nuclear warheads. For nearly 40 years, the plant operated in secrecy. Solvents used in the manufacturing process were dumped into unlined pits. Heavy metals leached into the groundwater. By the time the plant closed in 1994, the contamination plume extended for miles beneath residential neighborhoods. The cleanup is still ongoing. The latest estimates put the cost at over $300 million. But the drinking water in some areas is still unsafe. For 30 years, from 1947 to 1977, GE's capacitor manufacturing plants in Fort Edward and Hudson Falls, New York, dumped waste directly into the Hudson River. The waste contained polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, a family of synthetic chemicals prized for their stability and resistance to heat. Perfect for electrical insulation. Also toxic, carcinogenic, and nearly indestructible in the environment. Approximately 1.3 million pounds of PCBs flowed into the river during those 3 decades. That's not an estimate from activists. That's GE's own number, calculated from production records. PCBs don't break down. They don't dissolve. They sink into the sediment and stay there. They accumulate in the fatty tissue of fish, and when people eat those fish, the PCBs accumulate in them too. In 1975, state scientists began testing fish caught near Fort Edward. The results were alarming. Some fish had PCB concentrations over 300 parts per million, more than 100 times the level considered safe for human consumption. Commercial fishing was immediately banned on a 200-mile stretch of the river. Recreational fishing advisories were posted. The Hudson, once a source of food and income for thousands of families, was now officially poisoned. GE's response was immediate and aggressive. They didn't apologize. They didn't accept responsibility. Instead, they launched a public relations campaign that would last for decades. "We didn't cause this problem," became their mantra. They argued that PCBs were everywhere, in the air, in other rivers, in background environmental levels. How could anyone prove the contamination came from their plants? They spent millions hiring scientists to testify that PCBs were safe. They funded studies suggesting that dredging the contaminated sediment would actually make things worse by stirring it up. They took out full-page ads in newspapers arguing that the river was cleaning itself through natural processes, but internal documents told a different story. Documents that would only come to light years later through lawsuits and freedom of information requests. GE had known about the toxicity of PCBs since the 1960s. Their own scientists had raised concerns, but the message from management was clear. Keep producing. The profit margins on capacitors were too good to stop. It took until 2002, a full quarter century after the dumping stopped, for the Environmental Protection Agency to issue a final order. GE would dredge the river. They would remove the contaminated sediment. They would pay for it. GE appealed. They sued. They lobbied Congress. They argued that the dredging would cost billions and achieve nothing. They warned of economic disaster if they were forced to comply. The cleanup finally began in 2009. Over the next 6 years, specialized dredging equipment removed over 2.75 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment from a 40-mile stretch of the Upper Hudson. The material was loaded onto barges, transported to processing facilities, and eventually buried in licensed landfills. The cost to GE was approximately $1.5 billion. It was one of the largest environmental remediation projects in American history. But even today, the river isn't clean. Advisories remain in place. Pregnant women and children are warned not to eat fish from certain areas. The deeper sediments, the ones the dredging couldn't reach, still contain PCBs. And those PCBs will be there for generations. Because the half-life of environmental PCB contamination isn't measured in years, it's measured in decades. In some cases, centuries. The poison is still there, and it's not going anywhere. When Jack Welch became CEO in April 1981, he inherited an industrial giant. GE made turbines that powered cities, locomotives that hauled freight across continents, jet engines that flew millions of passengers every year, appliances that filled American homes. Real things, physical things, things you could touch. But Welch had a different vision. He looked at GE's organizational chart. Over 400,000 employees, hundreds of product lines, operations in dozens of countries, and saw waste, inefficiency, mediocrity. His philosophy was summarized in a single mandate. Be number one or number two in every market you serve, or get out. This was the beginning of what became known as Welchism, a management philosophy that would transform not just GE, but corporate America as a whole. The most notorious element was something called the vitality curve, though everyone who worked at GE called it by a different name, rank and yank. Every year, every manager was required to rank all of their direct reports on a forced curve. The top 20% were the stars, rewarded with bonuses and promotions. The middle 70% were told to work harder, and the bottom 10% were fired. It didn't matter if you were competent. If you were ranked in the bottom 10% of your division, you were gone. Inside a GE facility in Schenectady, New York, the same town where the company had been manufacturing turbines since the 1890s, A machinist named Robert had worked on the factory floor for 15 years. He was good at his job. He knew the machines. He trained new hires. But in 1995, he was called into a small office near the loading dock. A man from HR was there. "Your position has been eliminated." No severance beyond the legal minimum. No retraining program. Just a security guard who walked him to his locker and escorted him to the parking lot. The factory floor was quieter now. Half the machines had been sold off. The other half were being shipped to Monterrey, Mexico. Under Welch's leadership, GE cut over 100,000 jobs in the United States. Entire factories were shuttered. Towns that had depended on GE for generations watched their tax base evaporate. Welch didn't apologize. He celebrated it. Wall Street loved him. The stock price soared. But the bigger transformation was Welch's decision to turn GE into a financial powerhouse. GE Capital had existed since the 1930s as a small division that financed the purchase of GE appliances. Under Welch, it became the largest non-bank lender in the world. By the late 1990s, GE Capital was financing everything: real estate, credit cards, leveraged buyouts, insurance, and it was generating nearly 50% of GE's total earnings. But GE Capital's risks were hidden in consolidated financial statements. Investors couldn't see how much leverage it was using. Regulators struggled to oversee it because it wasn't technically a bank. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, the commercial paper market froze overnight. GE Capital couldn't roll over its short-term debt. Billions in obligations were coming due with no way to refinance them. The stock collapsed. On October 3, 2008, GE's share price dropped 13% in a single day. GE was forced to accept a $3 billion bailout from Warren Buffett and emergency support from the Federal Reserve. When Welch retired in 2001, his compensation package was revealed during his divorce proceedings. Lifetime use of GE's corporate jets, courtside seats at Wimbledon, access to luxury apartments in Manhattan and Florida. This was happening while workers were being laid off by the thousands, while factory towns were dying. The outrage was immediate. Welch eventually gave up some of the perks, but the damage was done. In 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced a settlement with General Electric. The company would pay a $50 million fine for accounting fraud. The charges related to activity between 2002 and 2003. During that period, GE had consistently met or exceeded Wall Street's earnings expectations quarter after quarter with almost supernatural precision. The SEC's investigation revealed the truth: manipulation. Executives had used improper accounting techniques to smooth earnings and avoid missing targets. They'd accelerated revenue recognition on locomotive sales. They'd changed the way they accounted for spare parts to shift hundreds of millions of dollars in costs into future periods. Why? To meet Wall Street's earnings per share expectations. Every quarter, without fail. The SEC called it fraud. GE paid the fine and promised to improve internal controls. But the real reckoning came 11 years later. In 2020, the SEC announced a much larger settlement: $200 million. Between 2015 and 2017, GE had failed to disclose massive problems in its power division and insurance portfolio. The power division, specifically the disastrous Alstom acquisition, was hemorrhaging money. But instead of acknowledging the problem, GE used accounting tricks to hide the losses. Internal employees called these techniques accounting drugs, borrowing from tomorrow to make today look good. The insurance problem was even worse. GE had sold long-term care insurance policies for decades, but they'd underestimated how long people would live and how expensive care would become. The reserves were massively insufficient. In January 2018, GE announced a $15 billion charge. $15 billion, wiped out in a single quarter. The stock collapsed. The fraud destroyed what little credibility GE still had. One former finance executive described the culture this way: "We were taught that missing the number was career death, so you did whatever you had to do." That was the legacy of Welchism. Not just layoffs and outsourcing, but a culture where the numbers mattered more than the truth. Jeff Immelt took over as CEO on September 10th of 2001. His first official day on the job was supposed to be September 11th. He was planning to attend a leadership meeting at GE's headquarters in Fairfield, Connecticut. Instead, he spent that day watching the Twin Towers fall. Two planes hit the World Trade Center. Both were powered by GE engines. It was an omen, a dark coincidence that seemed to mark the beginning of an era that would see GE's reputation and its market value collapse. Immelt inherited what looked like the greatest company in the world. Jack Welch had left him a diversified empire, generating over $100 billion in annual revenue. The stock was trading near its all-time high. Analysts called GE the most admired company in America, but beneath the surface, the problems were already there. GE capital was over-leveraged and opaque. The industrial businesses had been starved of investment during Welch's final years. The pension fund, which had looked healthy during the bull market of the 1990s, was starting to show cracks. Immelt tried to steer the company in a new direction. He launched an initiative called Eco-Magination in 2005. A push to invest in cleaner energy technologies, renewable power, more efficient turbines. He talked about sustainability and long-term value creation, a conscious rejection of Welch's short-term focus. But the damage from Welch's financial engineering was already done. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, GE's stock went into free fall. The dividend, which had been increased for 29 consecutive years, was cut by 2/3. Investors who had bought GE as a stable blue-chip investment watched their holdings evaporate. Immelt scrambled to stabilize the company. He sold off assets. He raised capital. He slashed costs. But he also made some disastrous bets. The worst was the 2015 acquisition of Alstom Power, the French company's gas turbine and power generation business. GE paid $10 billion. Later revised to nearly $13 billion after accounting adjustments. The logic seemed sound at the time. Emerging markets were building new power plants. Gas turbines were cleaner than coal. The infrastructure boom would create decades of demand. Except the world was changing faster than GE realized. Renewable energy, wind and solar, was becoming cheaper. Countries were committing to decarbonization. The market for new gas turbines was shrinking, not growing. Within 2 years, the Alstom acquisition had turned into a catastrophe. Orders dried up. The power division was losing billions. And there was no easy way out. Between 2017 and 2018, GE's market capitalization collapsed. The company lost more than $160 billion in value. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP of Hungary, wiped out in 18 months. The pension fund, which had once been overfunded, now showed a deficit measured in tens of billions of dollars. Thousands of retirees saw their promised benefits cut or frozen. The dividend was slashed again. Credit rating agencies downgraded GE's debt. In August 2017, Immelt was forced out. His replacement was John Flannery, a longtime GE insider who had run the healthcare division. Flannery lasted 14 months. During that time, he tried to stabilize the company through asset sales. GE sold its iconic appliance division to the Chinese company Haier. It sold its lighting business, the business that Thomas Edison had founded, the business that had invented the modern light bulb, to Savant Systems. It sold NBC Universal, the media empire that GE had owned since the 1980s. It sold its stake in Baker Hughes, the oil services company. It even sold its century-old industrial locomotive division to Wabtec. Everything that wasn't bolted down was sold, and even some things that were. But it wasn't enough. The stock kept falling. The debt kept mounting. The losses kept piling up. In October 2018, Flannery was replaced by Larry Culp, an outsider. the first CEO in GE's history who hadn't come up through the company's ranks. Culp's mandate was simple: save what could be saved, cut what couldn't. And 3 years later, he made the only decision left: break the company apart. But while the company was imploding, the executives who had presided over the collapse walked away wealthy. Jeff Immelt's total compensation during his 16-year tenure exceeded $200 million. He left with a generous severance package and a lifetime pension. John Flannery, despite lasting barely a year, received a severance package worth tens of millions. The workers, the engineers, the machinists, the technicians who had built turbines and engines and medical equipment got layoff notices. The retirees got pension cuts. The small-town shareholders who had trusted GE with their retirement savings watched their investments disappear. That was the price of failure at the top of corporate America. You could destroy billions in value, make catastrophic strategic mistakes, preside over accounting fraud, and still leave rich. In November 2021, CEO Larry Culp stood before investors and analysts on a conference call. His voice was steady, businesslike. He was announcing the end of an era. After 129 years, the General Electric Company, the conglomerate that had once been the most valuable corporation in the world, would cease to exist as a unified entity. It would be split into 3 independent companies: GE Aerospace, GE Vernova, GE Healthcare. The breakup was finalized in April 2024. The spin-offs were completed. The stock tickers were assigned. GE Aerospace kept the original GE symbol on the New York Stock Exchange, a symbolic gesture that meant nothing except for nostalgia. The conglomerate model that Jack Welch had celebrated, that business schools had studied, that analysts had praised for decades, was dead. Wall Street had decided it was too complex, too opaque, too risky. Investors wanted transparency. They wanted to be able to evaluate each business on its own merits, without the complexity of a massive holding company obscuring the details. They wanted to know exactly what they were buying, and they didn't trust GE anymore. The breakup was presented as a strategic move, a value-unlocking transaction that would benefit shareholders. And maybe it will. GE Aerospace, focused on jet engines, is profitable and growing. GE Healthcare, with its medical imaging technology, has solid fundamentals. But the separation also revealed an uncomfortable truth. The whole had never been greater than the sum of its parts. The synergies that Welch had talked about, the idea that owning light bulbs and jet engines and financial services under one roof created some kind of competitive advantage, had been an illusion, or worse, a lie. And the liabilities didn't disappear with the breakup. The Hudson River cleanup continues. The contamination at Hanford still requires monitoring. The pension obligations remain, spread across the 3 new companies. The workers who lost their jobs when factories closed didn't get them back. The towns that lost their tax base didn't recover. The people who drank contaminated water, who ate contaminated fish, who breathed radioactive iodine, they're still dealing with the health consequences. General Electric is gone, but the damage it caused remains. The death of General Electric didn't happen in a conference room in November 2021. It happened decades earlier. It happened when a group of executives in Geneva decided that a light bulb should burn out faster because selling more bulbs was more important than making better ones. It happened when managers at Hanford opened the valves and released radioactive iodine into the night sky, knowing that families downwind would breathe it in, because testing weapons detection equipment was more important than protecting human life. It happened when the company dumped 1.3 million pounds of toxic chemicals into the Hudson River for 30 years, because disposing of waste properly was more expensive than poisoning a river. It happened when Jack Welch looked at a factory floor filled with people who had devoted their careers to building things and saw only numbers on a spreadsheet. Numbers that could be reduced, optimized, eliminated. It happened when accountants manipulated earnings reports to meet Wall Street's expectations, because stock price was more important than truth. The dissolution of GE in 2024 wasn't the death, it was the burial. There's a light bulb in Livermore, California. It hangs in fire station number 6 in a small room near the engine bay. It's been burning since 1901. Over a century, 123 years of continuous operation. That bulb was manufactured by the Shelby Electric Company, a competitor of Edison's that went out of business decades ago. It has a hand-blown glass envelope and a carbon filament. It's never been turned off except for brief power outages and when the fire station moved locations. Thousands of people have made pilgrimages to see it. There's a webcam pointed at it, streaming 24 hours a day, so anyone in the world can watch it glow. That bulb was made before the Phoebus cartel, before planned obsolescence became the foundation of modern capitalism. Before executives learned that engineering products to fail was more profitable than engineering them to last. It still glows, dim but steady. A quiet reminder of what was possible before profit became the only engineering constraint. If you stand close enough, you can hear the filament, a faint hum, the sound of electricity moving through carbon, generating light and heat. It's a sound that GE, in all its years of manufacturing billions of light bulbs, spent millions of dollars trying to silence. Not by making a better product, by making one that would burn out faster. That sound, that quiet hum of something built to last, is what we lost. Not when GE broke apart in 2024, but decades before, when we stopped believing that the things we made should outlive us.